Hello and welcome back. This is the week 2 lecture. So now we're going to start on our traditional types of literature. As I mentioned last week, there are 3 major categories of literature that we typically study and analyze in a class like this. So those 3 categories are fiction, poetry, and drama. We're going to cover all 3, and we start today with fiction. So when we're talking about fiction, typically we're referring to novels or short stories. Now, as we're going to see, there are a few additional types that we can talk about, and I think nowadays, in our present moment, we see more and more sort of different kinds of fiction emerging. Some newer forms, new technology, new methods, so we have new stuff. But when we're talking about these traditional definitions and categories of literature, when we talk fiction, usually we're talking about novels and short stories. So we're going to go over the basic characteristics of fiction today. We're going to talk about some of the key elements that we typically study and analyze when we're looking at fiction. So today is an overview. We're just going to get comfortable. We're going to learn the basics when it comes to fiction. And then next week, in week 3, we're going to take a look at some specific examples of fiction. So we're mostly going to be looking at short stories because obviously they are shorter and easier to read in a single week. But I'm also going to include an excerpt from a novel. Next week, we don't really have time to read an entire novel, but we can at least look at a chapter from a novel, along with a couple of short stories. So that's what we'll do next week. But this week, I just want us to get comfortable with what fiction is, and I want us to know what to look for once we start reading fiction next week. So again, this is our first traditional literary genre. And if we want to track the history of fiction, we can actually go all the way back to the ancient world. So a lot of you are already familiar with novels and short stories. I'm guessing we've read some novels in our lives, maybe for school, maybe for pleasure. You've probably read a short story or 2, at the very least in a previous English class, and you're also probably familiar with ancient epics. And a lot of people would tell you that the ancient epic is really the first type of fiction to ever emerge in human society. So if we go back to the ancient Sumerians and the Epic of Gilgamesh, or if we go back to ancient Greece and we look at epics like the Iliad or the Odyssey, we can actually see a lot of the key characteristics that show up in contemporary fiction all the way back then with those epics. Now, it's important to remember that the ancient epic is written in verse. So those are considered to be poems, very long narrative poems. But they have a lot in common with modern day novels and short stories. In terms of how their plots unfold, the ways that they develop characters, the ways that they sort of develop distinctive scenes that we can look at and remember. So in a lot of ways, epics are kind of setting the stage for future forms of fiction. But do keep in mind the basic distinction between verse and prose. So verse is what we find in poetry. And that just means that, poems typically follow some kind of set pattern or structure, having to do with rhyme scheme, possibly, or the meter, or the way stanzas are arranged. And we're going to look at all of that once we turn our attention to poetry in a couple of weeks. But you guys probably know that poetry just looks different and it reads different compared to fiction. So with fiction, we're looking at prose. And prose doesn't really have to follow a set pattern or structure. Prose is a little bit more open-ended, a little bit more free-form, and it reads a little bit more like everyday speech. It might strike us as a little bit more realistic, usually. So keep that distinction in mind. Fiction is almost always going to be in prose. Novels and short stories are written in prose. Poetry, on the other hand, is written in verse. So again, don't get too confused about the ancient epics. We're not actually reading any ancient epics, and they are technically poems. But like I said, in the ways that they develop characters and plots and distinctive scenes, they have a lot in common with novels and short stories. And just the whole idea of the narrative, right? We talked a little bit about narrative last week. A narrative is simply a story, right? So those ancient epics, they told stories. They had large casts of characters. A lot of things happened. So if we sort of modernize those and put them in, say, contemporary prose, they would read a lot like typical novels with long plots, lots of characters, and really distinctive scenes that we can dig into and analyze. So those ancient epics have obviously been around for a long time, since the ancient world, and they really did sort of set the stage for future fiction. But then if we jump up into like the Middle Ages, we find another type of fiction emerging called the romance. And again, we're not going to read any of these, but it's important to just know a little bit about them. So the romance is a broad term that's often applied to narratives back in the Middle Ages that were written in both verse and prose. It kind of depended on the author. But typically they told stories, much like the ancient epics. They told stories about heroes going on some kind of a quest. Very typical plot. A hero going on a quest, overcoming obstacles, fighting, dragons or other kinds of like supernatural enemies, perhaps rescuing a damsel in distress, or, performing some kind of heroic deed. These were very common, throughout the 1400s in Europe. You would find them in France, Germany, virtually any European country, Spain, also the English-speaking parts of Europe, the British Isles. These were popular. And again, they told narratives very similar to those epics. They had heroes, they had well-developed plots, they had lots of action, and they typically had distinctive scenes and some degree of character development, but a lot of the characters were types. They weren't really super dynamic or round characters. You had heroes, you had villains, and then you might have a love interest, female characters who often, didn't really do a whole lot except wait to be rescued. There were exceptions, but that was another common type of fiction. But back in the old days, back in the Middle Ages and earlier, fiction was sort of taking a back seat to poetry. And in some cases, even drama. So drama's been around for a long time. The ancient Greeks had plays. They also had more traditional poetry. And those were kind of the dominant fictional categories. Poetry and drama, that remained true up through sort of early modern Europe. If we go back to like the Elizabethan era when Shakespeare was writing, fiction existed back then. Like I said, there were romances, people still read ancient epics, but drama and poetry were sort of more dominant back in the 1500s, the 1600s. Most people viewed poetry and drama as like the best, most important kinds of literature. And fiction was kind of behind them. Like, it was around, but it wasn't as big, maybe didn't sell as much, and wasn't thought of as quite as impressive or valuable as those other types of literature. But that power dynamic begins to shift as we get closer and closer to the modern age. So once we move up into like the 1700s and the 1800s, the novel begins to really emerge as the dominant type of fiction, the most dominant type of literature in general. It starts to surpass poetry and drama, particularly in the English-speaking world. So this is a very important historical development. So we can really trace the origins of the novel back to Spain in the 17th century, so the 1600s. The first novel that we often look at in sort of the European tradition is Don Quixote, which was written by Miguel de Cervantes in Spain in the 1600s. And a lot of people consider this to be the first modern novel. Now, of course, it was written in Spanish, but it was translated and read very widely over the course of a long period of time. So after that novel sort of kicks things off, we have increasing amounts of novels being written throughout the 1600s up into the 1700s. And by the 1700s, the novel becomes big in England. And this obviously matters for us here in the U.S. because at that time we were a colony or a collection of colonies belonging to England. So the novel really begins to pick up steam in the English-speaking world in the 1700s. And that's a really big century, just in terms of overall history, right? The American Revolution gets fought in that century, and there are major changes occurring in a lot of areas, not just literature, right? The Industrial Revolution is going on. The Enlightenment is going on. So we have all of these technological advancements. The world is changing. Society is changing. We have the growth of what we would now call the middle class. More and more people have leisure time. That wasn't necessarily the case in the ancient world or in the Middle Ages. But as we modernized, more and more people had kind of jobs that would look familiar to us now, right? They would go to work, they would get off work, they would come home, and they would have some free time. So what are you going to do in your free time? Well, a lot of people wanted to read novels. They wanted to read entertaining, fun narratives. And of course, there's no TV back then. There's no internet. There's no radio. So people read. That was a way to entertain themselves and pass the time. So in the 1700s, when all of this stuff's going on, the novel gets really big. First in England, and then, of course, it kind of migrates over here to the States. In the midst of all of these major changes. So again, in the 18th century or the 1700s, the novel really starts to gain steam and it really gets big. And again, a lot of the stuff that had been around ever since the ancient epics is still present in these novels. We have characters, we have long plots full of interesting events. Right? We have distinctive scenes, individual moments that we can sort of dig into and remember. But another thing that starts to change in the 1700s as the world changes is a lot of these narratives, a lot of these fictional narratives become more realistic. So back in the ancient world and back in the Middle Ages when we had those romances and like chivalric romances with knights saving damsels. Again, don't get confused. Those medieval romances don't necessarily mean like romance in our modern sense with boy meets girl romantic comedy, whatever. Those medieval romances were like about knights and dragons, and there was some love elements, but that's a different genre. But all of that stuff had a real supernatural bent to it. A lot of it featured sort of improbable events, supernatural creatures. There might have been some magic. There might have been some other sort of fantastical elements. But once we get up into the 1700s and the 1800s and the novel really starts to get big, a lot of these novels were more realistic. They were trying to present life as it really was. And they were trying to show individualized characters, real types of people, not necessarily knights or heroes on these big journeys fighting supernatural villains, but just people, regular people doing regular stuff. That becomes more and more common as the novel gets bigger. So showing the world as it really is and showing people as they really are. That becomes increasingly common with novels. So I just wanted to run through a few of the basic types of novel that we see. And all of these start to emerge and become quite popular in the 1700s. And like I said, first in places like England, Scotland, Ireland, and then they come over here to the States, and then they spread even more. So just a few major types. The picaresque novel is one type that we should be pretty familiar with, even if you don't know the name. So picaresque novels just mean that we have a story about some kind of rogue or scoundrel kind of character, like a sort of colorful, sort of renegade character, who's often getting into trouble, sort of getting into various fixes or sticky situations and then finding his way out of them. These were very popular in the 1700s. There was a famous novel called Tom Jones, written by Henry Fielding in England, and Tom Jones was very much this kind of character. He's kind of funny, he's kind of a rascal, he's getting into trouble, but he's also experiencing all these different things, and by reading about his experiences, we learn more about the larger society that he is functioning within. So a lot of these books were kind of satirical, they're kind of comedic, they're sort of poking fun at the larger culture or society that they take place in. A related type of novel is the Bildungsroman, which we just kind of call the coming of age story. It's also sometimes called the novel of education. So in these books, we have our main character basically growing up. We watch the character mature. We watch the character experience different things and learn about the world and, of course, about themselves. This is still a very popular type of narrative even today. I think you guys can find examples in shows, movies, all kinds of other media. One of the most popular types of Bildungsroman novels, one of the most popular Bildungsroman novels in the U.S. still remains The Catcher in the Rye. Some of you might have read that. It was written by J.D. Salinger back in the 50s. And it's about a young guy, a teenager, basically, coming of age, learning about the world, maturing in some ways, growing, developing, and learning more about himself. So that remains a very popular genre of the novel. We also have what's called epistolary novels. These are novels that consist of letters. Letters usually written by a first-person narrator. And we're going to talk more about what that means in a moment. But these are a little bit less common today, but they're still around. And some of the early, really popular novels were epistolary. So back in England in the 1700s, there were a lot of epistolary novels. They were quite popular. One of the early ones that caught Fire was called Pamela, written by Samuel Richardson, and some people say that's really the first super popular English language novel. It was written in the 1740s, and a lot of people over in the States, or what was then the colonies, read it, and a lot of early U.S. novels that came out at the end of the 1700s, early 1800s, they were also epistolary novels. So the whole book consists of letters, in some cases written by various characters, but most of the letters will usually be written by our first-person narrator, the main character in the novel. So they're still around. They're not as popular anymore, but you can still find epistolary novels. Also, historical novels. This is also a popular type of novel. It's been around for a long time. These will often draw upon real life events, real historical events, maybe even real people, but they're not straight history. They typically will fictionalize certain aspects of the history. They might invent some new characters, but they're very much based on real stuff and real people. So an English writer named Walter Scott wrote some really big historical novels back in the early 1800s that became very popular throughout the English-speaking world. And, he kind of helped create the formula. So we still have historical novels today. That remains a very popular genre. And then we have some stuff that we're definitely familiar with. Science fiction novels. They came along a little bit later, but that's obviously a big type that we still see today. Margaret Atwood, Isaac Asimov, Ursula Le Guin, a lot of famous sci-fi novelists. A lot of us might read sci-fi, sometimes fantasy and other speculative fiction kind of gets lumped in with sci-fi. So we can sort of create a larger category called speculative fiction. And I would argue that's probably the most popular type of fiction today. We don't just see it in novels. We also see it in short stories, and we're going to talk about short stories in a moment. But speculative fiction, that can include science fiction, fantasy, any kind of supernatural stuff. Horror is often classified under speculative fiction, or even superhero narratives can often be classified as speculative, just meaning not quite realistic, although some of them might be kind of realistic, but they are speculative because they're sort of about stuff that might not necessarily exist in the real world. So they're a little bit different than what we might consider realistic novels in the style of those older ones that got big back in the 1700s. Nowadays, speculative fiction is probably a little bit more popular. And a lot of us might read speculative fiction. Again, that's fantasy, sci-fi, superheroes, horror. All of that can kind of get categorized as speculative fiction. We also have detective fiction, crime fiction. All of that stuff's been around for a while. Detective novels have been around since the 1800s. Arthur Conan Doyle created the the Sherlock Holmes character back in the 1800s, and that character's still around. We might know Agatha Christie and some of her mystery or detective novels. This stuff is still around today, obviously, still a popular genre, a type of fiction. All right, so now let's talk a little bit about the short story, because we are going to be reading some short stories next week. So this is another type of fiction that can really trace its origins back quite a ways. You can kind of go back to the oral storytelling that was popular in a lot of ancient cultures, and even up through the Middle Ages. You can go back to, ancient myths and, fables, fairy tales, and even some of those shorter medieval chivalric romances were kind of the forerunners of the modern short story. Even some of the short, self-contained narratives that you find in the Bible can sometimes be considered the forerunners of the modern short story. But if we're thinking about the short story as we know it today, it's actually pretty recent. It didn't really come along in the English-speaking world until the 1800s. So a little bit after the novel gets big, short stories start getting big. And what's cool about short stories as Americans, we can take a lot of credit for the popularization of short stories. With these other kinds of literature, they were obviously around long before the U.S. became an independent country. And even with novels, right, they kind of got imported to us from England, our former, colonial masters. But the short story, we didn't necessarily invent it. Like some French guys were writing short stories a little bit before us, but writers like Nathaniel Hawthorne, Washington Irving, and Edgar Allan Poe, all Americans, they really helped to popularize the short story in the English-speaking world back in the 1800s. And you guys might know Poe. He remains pretty famous today. And even if we haven't read him, we know who he is. So these guys were writing in sort of the first half of the 1800s, and they really helped to kickstart the short story, which remains popular today. So, the short story's emerging at around the same time that the novel's getting really big, but also around the same time that newspapers are really becoming popular. So newspapers, as we know them, have really only existed since about the 1700s. So you got to keep in mind that the newspaper develops along with these major types of fiction, which is really quite interesting because if you think about journalism, if you think about news articles and the way they are typically written, they have a lot in common with fictional narratives, right? They have a lot in common with novels and short stories, just the way that the stories are told, right? Even in a news article, there's going to be characters, there's going to be some kind of a plot, stuff happens. There's some kind of a theme, there's some kind of a meaning that the author is trying to get across. So a lot of critics and scholars and historians have pointed out that the development of the newspaper is actually really closely connected to the development of novels and short stories. They're all telling stories. The only difference is some of those stories are fiction or, made up, and then in the newspapers, the stories are supposed to be nonfiction or real. But otherwise, there's not that much difference, and a lot of the techniques and strategies used to tell the stories are the same, whether we're looking at a newspaper or a short story. So keep that in mind. And from the very beginning, a lot of short stories would often appear in newspapers, and that continues to be the case today. A lot of newspapers continue to publish short stories, like the New Yorker. You can find them online. You can find them in hard copy form. So that remains kind of a tradition today. So obviously short stories are shorter than novels. We know that. And because of their shorter length, they can usually focus on one major action or one central character or location. They can be a little bit more focused. A novel covers more ground and does more stuff. A short story will often tackle just maybe a few characters, one big event, and maybe just a couple of different locations. So it's a smaller, more focused scope compared to what we're going to find in a novel. So they're not going to have quite the same long wind up and the big build up. They're typically going to be more, they're going to be a little bit more tightly condensed. And they might even begin pretty close to the climax. Instead of having that long build up to the climax like a novel, a short story might throw you right in the middle of the action and things are happening, big things are happening right away. So there's probably going to be a little bit less character development in a short story. There might be a little bit less description, and there might just be a single perspective because we have less room and we're getting right down to business a little bit faster than we would in an ancient epic or in a longer novel. Okay, so the final thing I want to do today is just quickly run through the key elements of fiction. The key elements that we're going to find in novels and short stories. These are things that we need to look for, think about, and analyze. And again, these are going to be familiar to most of us, and I've already mentioned some of these elements last week in my week 1 lecture when I was just going over all of the different literary elements that we're going to be using throughout this class. But of course, certain elements really apply to fiction, other elements apply more to poetry, and then when we eventually get to drama, there's going to be some unique elements that go along specifically with drama. So right now, let's just think about the big elements for fiction, beginning with plot. We already know what the plot is. It's just the events of the story. How do those events unfold? How are those events presented to us? That's what the plot really is, and that's how we should think about the plot. So typically, we're going to find plots in TV shows, in movies, in comics, in short stories, in novels, sometimes even in poems. Some poems are also telling stories. They also have narratives or plots. So we can find this in a lot of different places, but obviously in novels and short stories, we're always going to have some kind of a plot. So I mentioned the plot pyramid or the plot triangle last week. Some of you might be familiar with it. I gave you a link in the week 2 module so you can just get a visual for how most plots typically unfold. So usually we start with what's called the exposition. That's just like background information, getting us oriented in this fictional world. What's going on, right? Just giving us the information that we need to kind of get started. That's really what exposition refers to. So it's background info. Then we have what's called the rising action. So the exposition's at the bottom, and then as we start moving up one side of the triangle, that's the rising action. And typically in the rising action, some kind of conflict or complication will be introduced. There's always conflict in narratives, right? So once we meet the main characters and we get kind of oriented in our setting, as we go up that rising action, something happens. There's a conflict that develops, right? Or some kind of complication emerges that our main character is going to have to overcome or battle against. So that's usually what happens in the rising action. And then we reach the peak action, and that's the climax. That's the turning point. That's when big stuff happens. Maybe a fight, maybe a battle, maybe some kind of big momentous occasion. And this is obviously where a lot of our focus will go. But that's not where the story ends, right? After the climax, we have our final stage of the plot, which is usually called the resolution. This is like the falling action, right? This is how we wrap everything up. This is how we tie up our loose ends and conclude the story. So those are the typical sort of traditional stages of the plot. But what you guys are going to notice as we start reading and experiencing different kinds of fiction, not all plots necessarily include all of those different stages. Some plots might skip the exposition. Some plots might get us to the climax really quickly. Like I said, that's true sometimes in short stories, particularly very short stories. There might not be a lot of rising action. We might start out and find ourselves near the climax very soon. Sometimes we don't really have much resolution. Sometimes things end very abruptly right after the climax. So people can always, writers can always play around with these different stages, but just be aware of the major stages so you can track the plots that you read. And also keep in mind that we can have flashbacks or flash forwards in a lot of plots. So we know what a flashback is, right? That's when we're going back in time to show something that previously happened. Those can often be very important in a plot, but we can also move forward in time, right? We can jump ahead and see things that are going to happen in the future. We can also have foreshadowing, right? Where we get some hint or indication of something that's going to happen later. And those are important as well. So remember that plots can unfold in a chronological fashion. That means from start to finish, going in sort of a linear, forward-moving fashion, but not all plots are like that. You guys know, sometimes we start at the end, and we might work our way back to the beginning. Other times we might start in the middle and we're kind of jumping around. So just be aware that there are a lot of different chronologies. There can be reverse, we might see some plots moving in reverse chronological order. We can do a lot of different things with time and time sequence and the way all of that is presented. All right, the next key element to remember is characters. And I don't need to say much about this. Just remember that any kind of fiction, whether it's a novel or a short story, is going to be very much centered on some characters, the people that are inhabiting the story. So again, some characters are really individuals. They are round and dynamic. That means that they change, they develop over time, they grow and learn things, just like real humans in the world. But other characters might be considered to be flat and not dynamic, kind of static, meaning they don't change, they don't develop. And in some cases, certain characters can be seen as types. They're supposed to represent larger classes of people. Right? They're representatives of larger groups. And we're going to see some examples of that perhaps next week. So you can have like the high school jock character, for example. That's a character type. And maybe that character in a particular narrative does not really get developed. He's just like the good-looking star quarterback who might be kind of mean to the nerds or whatever. That's a type, right? That's not necessarily an individualized, distinctive character. That might just be a character that's meant to represent a type of person. But we might get more individualized, realistic characters that change, grow, and develop over time. So just be familiar with that basic distinction. Also, remember that the main character of a narrative will typically be the protagonist. And then the villain, or the person standing in the way of what the protagonist wants, that's typically going to be considered the antagonist. But remember, protagonists are not always necessarily heroes. They're just the main character. And often the plot or the story will be sort of revealed through the main character's perspective. And then the antagonist doesn't necessarily have to be a villain. It's just a person who is opposed to the protagonist in some way. And in some cases, the antagonist might not even be a person. It might be society, it might be nature, it might be an animal. So remember, there's a lot of different kinds of conflict. Most narratives in fiction are driven by conflict between the protagonist and whatever the protagonist is up against. But there can be a lot of different kinds of conflict that we can track. Also, let's think about point of view. How is the story delivered? Typically, we have three major types of point of view that we can look for. We have first person point of view, and I think we know what that is. That's when the protagonist is telling the story. And we know that we're dealing with first person because we see the first person pronouns. I did this. This happened to me. So now the main character, is telling the story, delivering it from their own first person perspective. So we see a lot of examples of that, but we also see third person narration. Third person narration, or a third person point of view, means that we have some kind of outside storyteller. Maybe an omniscient third person perspective. Omniscient means godlike. It means the narrator knows everything. So an omniscient third person narrator exists outside the story, and they are telling us what happens. But they're not usually in the story, right? Again, they're kind of like God. They're up above looking down at all the humans in the plot. And they're telling us what happens to all of these people, what these people are saying and doing and maybe even thinking. But we can also find other types of third-person narration. So sometimes, like in The Great Gatsby, for example, we can get a narrator who's in the story, but not necessarily the main character. Or we see this in Moby Dick with Ishmael, right? This is a third-person narrator to an extent, right? Because they're not the protagonist, right? They're not the featured player. They're not the main character. They're in the story, right? But they're telling it sort of from a more third-person perspective. It's kind of at a remove. They're not the main character. So their perspective is not quite the same as what we would typically get with a traditional first-person narrative perspective. So there's always going to be a narrator, right? The question is, who is the narrator? Is the narrator the main character? Or is the narrator some omniscient, godlike narrator who exists outside the story? Or could the narrator be a minor character in the story that's giving us all the information, and oftentimes they're not even a major player, they're just telling us what happens? We need to always be aware of what kind of point of view we're dealing with. What kind of narration are we dealing with? And then finally, setting. We should always think about the setting, and I mentioned this last week. There are two levels when it comes to setting. Physical, geographical setting, like where are we, like physically, what is our location, what country are we in, what state or city, where are we physically, and then there's also the time element, temporal setting. What time period are we in? Is this present day? Are we in some previous historical period? Or are we in the future? With a lot of speculative fiction like sci-fi or fantasy, we might be in the future or in the past. With a lot more realistic fiction, we might be in the present, or if it's historical, if it's a historical novel, we might be in the American Revolution or World War II or some previous historical period. But just remember, when we're thinking about all of these different elements that show up in fiction, they always work together, right? They're always working together to create the overall experience that this novel or short story is shooting for. Okay, so that's it for this week. Next week, we're going to look at a couple of short stories and an excerpt from a novel. But in the meantime, here in week 2, you have your first alternative media assignment. And what I want you guys to do is to apply some of these elements that we talked about today to some other form of media. So don't pick a novel or a short story. Talk about a TV show, a movie, a graphic novel, maybe even a piece of music that contains some of these same elements. That's what we do with the alternative medias. We take the elements common to literature and we apply them to these other text types, these other types of writing, or even visual storytelling that's often not considered to be literature. But we're going to see some of the ways that they share a lot in common with literature. So pick an alternative media type and apply what we've learned today to whatever you choose. That's your first alternative media. Let me know if you have any questions, and I will see you next week.